Okay, we are going to get started. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. My name is Enrique Desmond Arias. I am the Marx Chair of Western Hemisphere Affairs and professor at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs here at Baruch College in the City University of New York. Our session today is being recorded. This summer, with the election of Gustavo Petro as president, Colombia has arrived at a potentially remarkable inflection point in its history. For more than 70 years, Colombia has been in varied states of civil conflict. This is the longest active conflict in the hemisphere, and in the modern era, perhaps the longest conflict of any country in the region. Over the years, varied armed organizations operating in the country have included drug gangs, paramilitaries, the Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, the FARC, the National Liberation Army, the ELN, and the M19. Colombia's new president, Mr. Petro, had been a member of the M19 in his younger days in the 1980s, and had been a leader in that organization's peace process with the Colombian government. After leaving the armed struggle, he served several terms in Colombia's Congress and was later elected mayor of Bogotá, the country's capital city. In 2016, I conducted interviews in one neighborhood in southern Bogotá that had been founded with the help of guerrillas, and Mr. Petro was remembered there fondly by inhabitants of the neighborhood while he was serving as mayor. This spring, he was elected Colombia's first president from the left of the political spectrum in a very, very long time. His election opens up a host of questions and possibilities for the country's politics, society, and economy. His Pacto Histórico coalition also was elected with the largest number of seats to the Colombian House and the Colombian Senate, creating numerous different opportunities for adopting new forms of legislation, new policy approaches to many of the problems that have been challenging Colombia for many years. This session will discuss the first several months of Mr. Petro's presidency, examining the evolving nature of conflict and violence there, the government's peace and drug policies, engagement with regional partners, including Panamá, Venezuela, and the United States, as well as the government's emerging drug policy, energy, and economic policies. Today, we have with us two distinguished experts on Colombian politics who will help us to better understand Colombia's politics today under its new political leadership. The first is Arlene B. Tickner. She is a professor of international relations in the Faculty of International, Political, and Urban Studies at the Universidad del Rosario in Bogotá, Colombia. Before coming to the Universidad del Rosario, she was a professor of in the political science department at the Universidad de los Andes for over 2 decades. She has a PhD in international studies from the University of Miami and a Master of Arts in Latin American Studies from Georgetown University. Dr. Tickner's main area of research includes the sociology of knowledge in the field of international relations and the evolution of international relations in non-Western settings, Latin American and hemispheric security, Colombian foreign policy, and Colombian-United States relations. She is the co-founder and co-editor of the Routledge book series, Worlding Beyond the West, and serves on the editorial advisory boards of a number of international journals. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Tickner writes a weekly newspaper column in the Colombian daily El Espectador, a very important newspaper in Colombia, and gives frequent interviews in distinct national and international media outlets. Our second participant is Juan Albarracin. He is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Illinois at Chicago and a research affiliate of the Notre Dame Violence and Transitional Justice Lab, part of the Kellogg Institute of International Studies. Previously, he was a visiting assistant professor at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame and an assistant professor at the Universidad ICESI in Cali, Colombia. The conversation today will start with a roundtable discussion, including our two distinguished participants. This will continue for a period of time, around 45 minutes, after which we will take questions from the audience. Questions can be submitted to the chat box and we will then sort through those and organize them to ask the participants. So I wanted to start out with a general question to put to each of our participants, and that is, it has now been nearly 3 months since Mr. Petro's inauguration. What do you see as the most important political developments during this time? Professor Tickner, can you get us started?
Sure. Thanks so much, Desmond. I'm really happy to be here with you and to share this space with both Desmond and Juan and all of you. I just wanted to start out by stating that Colombia has never had a leftist president, just to reinforce the historical moment that the country is living. It's not that it hasn't happened in a long time; it's never happened. And so, in addition to the longstanding armed conflict that we have undergone in the country, we've never actually had progressive leftist leadership. And I think the election of Petro is even more remarkable given his vice presidential formula, Francia Marquez, who, as many of you probably know, is an Afro-descendant, well-known social leader who rose up, from very humble origins in a country which is both unequal and I would say highly racist. And so the combination of the two being elected, I think speaks to the particular and special moment that Colombia is undergoing today. And just to kind of provide a moment of background, I think we have to contextualize their election within also an unusual context for the Colombian situation of increasing social discontent and protest. Latin America has undergone a wave of social protests since since 2019, more or less. But this is something that has been atypical in the Colombian context. Many would say because of the existence of the armed conflict, among other things. We don't have a long tradition of social protests in this country, and so this moment kind of led to the election of Petro and Francia Marquez. Given the uniqueness of this situation, being able to score points in the first 100 days has been very much on the mind of the newly elected government. And I think there's several things that we might point to in terms of interesting and promising political developments. And I think we'll delve into them more deeply in subsequent rounds of the conversation. But I wanted to point out a few. Obviously, beyond the election itself, governing, has proven to be a challenge given the uniqueness of this situation. And Petro has set out to create a broad coalition in the Congress to allow for wider levels of governability. And I think to his credit, he and his team have been, particularly successful in creating a very broad group of not like-minded parties and political actors that have joined forces with the government, perhaps in their own pragmatism, with an eye to supporting the government's agenda. So I think that's an interesting political development in itself, in a country that's highly polarized, as many countries in Latin America. Leaders such as Petro and Lula will be another case in Brazil, have had to reach out to actors on other sides of the political spectrum in order to be able to govern. Obviously, his proposal to strike up what he calls paz total, total peace, many have called it progressive peace, is something that I think we'll talk about later. But I just want to underscore the importance of this idea of total peace on Petro's governing agenda. And this includes not only implementing the peace accords with the FARC that the previous government of Ivan Duque has been accused, I think fairly, of not implementing in a robust fashion, but also negotiating with the remaining insurgent group ELN, whose negotiations fell apart when Duque took over the presidency 4 years ago, as well as a more controversial proposal to negotiate, or it's called, I don't know how you say sometimiento in Espanol, in English, but it's a handing, a surrender of criminal organizations, kind of akin to a plea bargaining system, I would say, in the United States, which has, sparked debate and controversy both in Colombia and in other countries such as the United States. And then finally, the last component of this is Petro's notion of human security, which he's also pushed quite strongly in the first 100 days of government. And we'll come back to this after when we talk about, among other things, civil-military relations. It's been interesting to observe how the armed forces have quickly tried to accommodate to this notion of human security with an eye to adjusting to the priorities of the new government. Another point in Petro's favor has been the resumption very quickly upon taking power of relations with Venezuela, which had been, frozen for over 5 years, and the opening of the border, which has led to, a very positive view on the part of most people in Colombia. And I guess another thing that I want to point out is Petro's drug policy, still in the making, but he has been very outspoken in these first 100 days on the need to devise an alternative drug policy, given his view that the war on drugs has been a key factor in violence and in the extension of the armed conflict in Colombia. And this is something that has come up as well in our Truth Commission's report, pointing to the role of the drug war in the extension in time of the conflict and obviously its violence. And just one more point. I think another interesting political development has been the participatory kind of spirit with which the government has tried to start developing both its development plan and its security and defense policy. It is currently holding regional dialogues that will be binding in different parts of the country with an eye to picking up on different communities' discontents and proposals for feeding a more socially robust development policy and obviously a more participatory one. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay, wonderful, Arlene. Dr. Tickner, thank you so much. Juan, Dr. Albarracin, how do you see politics shaping up in the first 30 days, in the first 3 months of Mr. Petro's presidency?
Oh, thank you, Desmond, for this invitation. I'm really happy to share the space with Arlene and you today. This is quite an honor. I'm going to reemphasize some points that Arlene made because I feel that we're kind of like-minded in many ways in which we're seeing the first 3 months of the Petro administration. I think it's really worth highlighting once again the historic moment that Colombia is experiencing right now, and seeing the election of Gustavo Petro in this kind of more broader context of political change in Colombia, thinking about how the Petro presidency is possible because kind of the fundamentals of Colombian politics have changed in the last couple of years, mainly associated with the successful the signing of the peace agreement with the FARC. So a lot of what we're seeing now wouldn't have been possible just 4, 5, 6 years ago. So I think that is truly historic, and it helps us understand a little bit of what's going on right now as the Petro administration kind of starts and tries to implement some of its promises. So I think the first kind of point it's really important to make is that we're seeing for the first time, maybe since 2018, but really solidly in 2022, that the issues that used to be central in Colombian politics, like the way we deal with armed conflict, which was kind of a dividing line and cleavage in Colombian politics, started to become less relevant. Not meaning that it's not relevant, but that other issues that had been for the most part swept under the rug, like really profound issues and discussions about socioeconomic matters and the tremendous inequality in Colombia, well, they've become kind of more central cleavages in Colombian politics. And if you think about the fact that this past runoff in June of 2022, it's the first time in 20 years, since 2002, that a candidate belonging to Uribismo was not on the ballot. That is quite telling of the moment that we were living. And the elections that we had, at least the runoff that we were having in 2022 in June, there was a unknown experience for many Colombians who have been voting in the last 20 years. So that in and of itself tells you a little bit about the moment. And Petro and his election it's an indication of this broader moment of political change in the country. I think given this, it's interesting to understand some of the things that have been happening a couple of months, and to understand how the left in Colombia had some experiences governing, as you mentioned, Desmond, cities, maybe some regional governments, but had never really had a chance to govern the entire country. So when you start thinking about some of the characteristics of it, it was clear that the left is still trying to realize, and at least part of the left and part of the movements associated with Pacto Histórico, what does it actually mean to govern? And what does it mean to be part of the government now and not the opposition or of a grassroots movement? So I'm going to start with kind of some of the things, like when you see some of the unforced errors that have been happening in the government, part of it is kind of the growing pains of becoming a government. So you see some ministers and some members of the government who have had less, let's call it, yeah, they've been very their expressions in public and the way they're dealing with certain issues appear to be kind of more of an amateur nature. And that is in part because of this, because it's the first time that some of these people coming from these more traditional leftist movements are actually in power. So there's some part of this last 3 months that is growing pains. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the Minister for Energy and Mining and her remarks about the change of the energy policy, but and sometimes in talking about broader economic terms. So that has caused some friction and some critique. I think Arlene mentioned a very important point, which is the government was incredibly successful in creating this coalition that just yesterday and today and a couple of weeks ago has been able to pass really important pieces of legislation. So the fact that the government has been able to pass a tax reform, reforma tributaria, is remarkable. It is not easy for any government, for that matter, in Colombia to get this done, and that some of its priorities actually managed to get through Congress is indeed quite remarkable. It is also very remarkable that the government passed its laws that will enable it to pursue its total peace policies and its negotiations with the ALN and armed organized criminal groups. So there are successes there. The government was also quite successful, and I think Mr. Petro was quite successful in building a cabinet that both combines a lot of experience of previous, of people who are not necessarily already part of these leftist movements, but that have progressive credentials and whose government experience is crucial in enacting some key legislation aspects like tax reform, like education, like rural development. So they were very smart in picking people who are able to use their previous government experience to get some of these things done. And it also combines more voices coming more directly from kind of the core of the Pacto Histórico, because there is this expectation, and a legitimate expectation, that the first leftist government has to also respond to its base at some point and to some degree. So both representationally, but also in matters of public policy. So you can't expect a government of the first government of the left to completely forget some of its key core issues. And I think it's a balancing act, what you're trying to see here, trying to keep some level of stability, at the same time trying to pass some of the very critical and promised reforms by Petro. I'm going to leave it there because I'm sure we're going to talk about these specific issues.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Albarracin. So the next question that I wanted to ask is, one of the biggest issues on Colombia's agenda for some time is the issue of conflict and violence, right? These are leading issues on the country's agenda. As Dr. Tickner said in the last round of questions, Colombians are very concerned about stability, safety, security, right? These are huge issues that have been a focus of the country's national political agenda for a long time, with a lot of cause, right? 70 years of conflict is going to make people focus on conflict as an issue. Starting with you, Dr. Barracin, could you discuss the Petro administration's approach to the conflict, his total peace policy, and what's going on with that, and how you see the prospects for rooting peace in the country in the coming years?
Well, thank you. This is the total peace agenda is a lot. It's basically a moving target right now. So what I'm trying to do is try to present something that is based on something that is actually moving a lot as we speak. So it's hard to really nail it down and say this is what is happening. But I think in general terms, we can think of, as you mentioned, this idea that the 2016 peace agreement, while a landmark agreement which brought about the demobilization of the largest guerrilla group in Colombia, it wasn't a complete agreement in the sense that other armed groups, including the ELN guerrilla, remained active and controlling significant parts of the Colombian territory and involved in different ways and degrees with illicit economies and controlling and governing certain parts of Colombia, either for the rebel governance or criminal governance. So this is not new for people who know Colombia, but it is a starting point. And of course, the existence of these armed groups, being guerrillas, organized crime groups, affects both the implementation of the peace agreement, but the longer kind of possible trajectory of a Colombia where politics is no longer where at least violence is no longer an instrument of political competition. So in this administration, the idea is to kind of finish up the homework that was made with the FARC agreement, and that the core is to, through negotiations, bring about the demobilization both of the ELN guerrilla and also of these other armed groups, which are more of a criminal nature. And again, this is a complex issue, how you define criminal and how you think about these groups, but in general, separating both these more insurgent type groups from these more criminal groups. And that is, as I will say in a couple of minutes, that is a very complicated thing to do in engaging in negotiations. So the government, in essence, is negotiating in parallel with, or wants to negotiate in parallel with all these groups, kind of at the same time. It's not unique. We have Santos government negotiated with the FARC, and at the same time it started negotiations with the ELN. So it's not the first time that a government's kind of juggling multiple negotiations at the same time, but it is in and of itself a difficulty. When you think about the ELN rebel group, even if it's a rebel group, it's much different than the negotiation we're having with the FARC. There's extensive research showing how the kind of the organizational structure, or more federation type of the ELN makes it a particularly difficult group to negotiate with. In previous negotiations, it was clear that it was crucial that all the different commanders are buying into the process. And in the previous attempt, at least a significant part of the ELN was not very much supportive of the negotiation efforts that were going on in with the government. So this is a tricky group to negotiate with in principle. Like it's going to be a difficult negotiation. If you add the fact that while you're negotiating with the ELN, you're negotiating with other armed groups, sorry, it's a difficult task to do, because these negotiations, while separate, are not independent from one another. So the ELN has already signaled that it's not really happy that that the government's negotiating with the ELN at the same time that it's negotiating with armed organized criminal groups, because it sees that its political kind of status might be diminished if other groups are also negotiating with the government. And then you have the negotiations with organized criminal groups, which we've had discussions about this in several venues. They are complicated negotiations. So there's a part of the media which has been very critical of them, because there's this idea that in principle you shouldn't negotiate with criminal groups, that you might negotiate with more politically oriented groups like rebels, but you never do that with criminal groups. That is a complicated debate. I don't want to get into that, but it just shows you that just negotiating with organized criminal groups it's extremely complicated because public opinion and certain sectors of the population are very reticent to accept this type of negotiations, even though they happen all the time. This is not new. This is not new to Colombia, but it is a harder type of negotiation. It's a type of negotiation with these groups that is seen more critically by public opinion. And it's also a different type of negotiation because you're dealing with a different type of actor, and it has to be quite clear what the government wants to get out of this. So right now, this is kind of the starting point. That's where we are right now. It's not very clear what these strategic objectives are. I mean, the broader objective is to demobilize these groups. But how are we going to get about this? How are we going to be able to engage with organized criminal groups in a manner that effectively demobilizes them and brings them out of the equation? Or how do we bring about the broader stability and peace in areas where these groups are still operating, which is not an easy question to answer. And we also have to remember, and just to wrap that up, that these groups are not acting in a vacuum. We can't think about these groups as just being completely independent from political realities that are happening in the areas they control. So these are groups that have important connections with local elites. These are groups that are connected with other important social actors. And thinking about these interconnectedness and the variation you see across Colombia is quite complicated. So it's just not a fact of just negotiating with these groups. You have to think about the broader context in which they operate and control.
Thank you, Dr. Albarracin. Dr. Tickner, how do you see the total peace policy evolving?
I don't have much to add to Juan's very comprehensive analysis, maybe a few points. I like the idea of a moving target. I think conceptually speaking, the notion of total, some people don't like that term. I would like to call it progressive peace. That theoretically speaking, I find it spot on for thinking about what to prioritize in peace building processes, such as that being undertaken in Colombia, and as well how to go about attending to violence, which is ultimately what this whole strategy seeks to address. Colombia, if not all of Latin America, is part of the most violent zones of the world. And so going about combating violence, especially as it affects vulnerable communities in rural areas of the country, has been declared a priority in this whole process. So, again, conceptually speaking, I think it's it's a solid policy. I think the mechanics and the timing, which I think Juan has already suggested, is tricky. And as he says, my sense is that even though the conceptual apparatus is in place, the steps through which this is all going to happen are still being, the details, if you like, are still being worked out, because we're talking about a government that just took over less than 100 days ago, which has started speaking to all of the different violent actors involved, but that obviously is by no means close to implementing all of these negotiations at the same time. The ELN process, which again ended when President Duque was elected, is something that it's hoped can be started rather quickly, because there's a political will to reinstate negotiations, and there's actually a basis upon which to proceed with them, given that they had already begun. And so I think our hope is that the historical memory of that process, as it evolved several years ago, is an important input in terms of seeing how to push it forward. One aspect of this whole complex process that Juan didn't mention is negotiations with those members of FARC that either bailed on the peace accords or that never submitted to them. And this is also a discussion taking place in Colombia. So whereas those actors that are called dissidents that didn't buy into the process from the beginning, it's argued that we can have a political negotiation with them. There's a whole set of other actors that bought into the process, that signed the accords and then defected. One of these is Ivan Marquez, who many of you might have heard his name, who's been operating between Venezuela and Colombia. It's controversial in many sectors to argue that even though he defected from the process, he betrayed the process, if you wish, there has to be some sort of political negotiation with him. So I think that's a sensitive issue in addition to negotiations with criminal groups. As far as, and again, the government is being very careful in calling these negotiations with criminal organizations. We're calling it sometimiento, a voluntary process by which these groups submit to the judicial system. This is not going to be part of the transitional justice system that's in place for political negotiations. In addition to the complexities of the negotiation, I myself think that Petro has been quite pragmatic in just assuming that criminal governance is a fact of life in many parts of Colombia, if not in throughout Latin America. And if this is so, one of the only ways to go about dismantling these organizations, given the illegality of drugs, in addition to other illicit substances, is to actually try to negotiate with them. And there's interesting experiments that have taken place in other parts of the region and the world and in Colombia that I think at least provides some element of hope that this might work. One aspect that I find, or two, disconcerting or problematic, have to do first with the presence of international criminal organizations in Colombia. We're not just talking about national groups, and obviously the government has said that it will only strike up these agreements with those groups that are national. But the whole question of what you do then with the Mexican organizations, Italian organizations, Nigerian, Russian, the list goes on, I think remains to be seen. And here the whole international aspect or the transnational aspect of the drug trade and other illicit flows, I think, comes into play. So unless there's, in tandem with these negotiations, some sort of collaboration with other countries whose nationals are involved in illegal criminal activities in Colombia, it's going to be hard for this to stick in terms of the dismantling of these groups and whatnot. Another factor that I find problematic, which has to do with the final component of this paz total that I spelled out, is the whole social and human security part, which I see as forming an integral part of this whole, theoretical idea of total peace. And here, the point I want to make is that even if the government is successful in dismantling those criminal organizations that are operative in Colombia, there's a whole, pool of youth that are unemployed, unschooled, and poor that, unless something is done simultaneously with the illicit trades themselves, it will be very hard to avoid having others, especially youth, fill the voids created by these organizations. So I think this is something else that at least concerns me and that I don't think has been thought through in sufficient detail, at least not yet. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tickner. So the next question, so the previous era of progressive governance that I've been referencing, is the Revolución en Marcha from the 1930s, which can be interpreted different ways, right? But the debates about inclusion and integration of poor working class Colombians, in part, were the tensions that gave rise to the current period of conflict that the country's been going through in different iterations since the 1950s. I wanted to ask, with Mr. Petro as the is the first former guerrilla to ascend to the presidency, someone who participated in that conflict against the government, even though it was much earlier in his career. What do you think this means for Colombia? And also, what do you think this means for civil-military relations in the country in the coming years? And I wanted to start with Dr. Tickner on this question.
I agree that the revolution in Marcha, proposed by López Pumarejo, could be construed as progressive, maybe not leftist, but potentially. It's interesting to note how Petro himself makes reference to La Revolución en Marcha and the proposed agrarian reform in Colombia that was never successful as a point of reference. I think it's also, when you look at other governments in Latin America that have, whose presidents have emerged from insurgent groups, obviously there's a lot of challenges at stake in terms of widespread, public acceptance and relations with security forces, both the military and the police. I just want to point out that the M19 is a quite different insurgent group than others that have been operative in Colombia. And Petro was more part of the intelligentsia than the armed faction of this very much urban, educated, middle-class organization. And yet, he has obviously been stigmatized by the right for being a part of this. In terms of civil-military relations, there obviously are a lot of challenges at play right now. One of them has to do, obviously, with the fact that he was part of an insurgent organization and the types of, mistrust that strikes up among the armed forces. When Petro took over, he also made the decision to purge both, in particular, the army and the police. In the army, of many suspected of participating in extrajudicial killings, and in the police, we still don't have a sense of why so many high-ranking officials, generals, were removed from the institution. And this has led to an additional source of discontent within both that is still being worked through. So there's huge challenges, I would say, in terms of striking up a rapport with the security forces in terms of, the potential skepticism that the election, not only of a former guerrilla, but also a leftist, has created in the armed forces. And this kind of leads me to the final aspect of, the sources of mistrust. I don't think it has that much. I don't think it has as much to do with Petro's, background in the M19 as it does with his leftist background and his view of security. The left in Colombia, if not all of Latin America, has been, tremendously weak in terms of developing its own approach to security and defense policies. And so this is basically an area of public policy that has been customarily left in the hands of the political right, that has also been ceded in a very significant degree to the security forces themselves. So we're in a country and in a region in which the armed forces and the police submit to civilian authority, but actually exercise disconcerting levels of autonomy in terms of devising doctrine, strategy, and whatnot. And Colombia is not an exception to this observation. So when Petro starts talking about human security as that, pillar of what his government, sees as its security and defense policy, this obviously creates, concern and, I don't know if disconcertment would be the correct term, but it creates concern within the armed forces. I'm including here the police because we're talking about a group of actors that have both been involved in an armed conflict for many decades, that have been trained to combat internal enemies, both insurgent groups and, for instance, criminal organizations. and that, are hard pressed to just change their chip and accommodate to the idea of human security. So I actually see that as the three main challenges. First, the development of a convincing security and defense policy, which we still have not seen. There's also a participatory strategy going on whereby the Ministry of Defense is seeking out opinions, both from academia and from different communities affected by violence themselves, but also gaining the trust of the different members of the armed forces. And finally, helping the armed forces accommodate to this new idea of human security, which I think it remains to be seen to what extent that they're able to switch their chips so quickly and devise a view of human security, which stresses much more strongly in the Colombian context those social aspects of security, in comparison to security and defense strategies that have been highly militarized and highly focused on combating internal enemies.
Thank you, Dr. Tickner. And I wanted to give you, Dr. Albarracin, the chance to answer this question. How do you see civil-military relations evolving in the coming months and years?
Yeah, so I'll start with the point that my expectation was this was going to be far more worse than it is actually what we're seeing right now. So it could be that that there's a lot of stuff happening in the bottom that I'm not seeing, but at least publicly, this has been much less bumpy, so to speak, than I had expected. And let me tell you why. Because as the elections were happening, March to June, we saw let's call this a very public petitioning of some members of the armed forces against Mr. Petro's potential election in ways that were, worrisome for any scholar who's interested in the survival of democracy, having armed leaders of the armed forces commenting publicly about candidates, and in particular about Mr. Petro. So there was an unusual, very public involvement of certain members of the armed forces, of high commanders of the armed forces in Colombian electoral politics. And that was extremely worrisome. So that's kind of the basis I had for my expectations. And having that as my expectation, the last couple of months have been, again, surprisingly very calm. Again, might be that something's happening in the bottom, but at least for now, it's extremely calm for my expectation. And this, I agree with Dr. Tickner. It's not because Mr. Petro comes from the guerrilla, it's because he's from the left. And let me preface that with some research that we've been seeing. We know surprisingly very little about the military in Colombia. There's studies, but for a country where the armed forces have such a central role, we're still missing a lot of information about them. There's somewhat of a black box. But we do know some things, and there's this wonderful research by Alejandra Ortiz Ayala that shows that even at the kind of the let's call it the rank and file, there is this kind of very strong stigma within the armed forces against the left, anything that's related to the left. So, and much more so, the left is interpreted for this idea of insurgency. So anything that has to do with the left must be somewhat insurgent. So if you have an armed forces that are socialized and have these ideas circulating among them, it is extremely hard. You have a very difficult starting point to have a very productive relationship between a civilian leadership of the left and the armed forces. So given that, we're seeing a lot of interesting developments. And even though the Petro government has not been holding back a lot. So as Professor Tickner mentioned, there has been a reshuffle of officers, of important commanders, both in the armed forces and in the police. The nomination of a minister of defense that is known for his fights against impunity and of uncovering corruption in Colombia, specifically the relationships between politicians and former and paramilitary groups. So this is a person who's coming into the administrative defense whose reputation is for uncovering corruption and for reforming and for having a human rights perspective. So the Petro administration really said, yeah, this is we're at least we're trying to get a new route in terms of defense and security. So given that, again, it's really surprising how smooth things have been. The Petro administration has emphasized, in my view, in the last couple of weeks, a lot about improving the conditions of the rank and file. So there's all of these imagery of the president visiting military bases across the country and sharing meals with soldiers instead of eating with the commanders in kind of more select restaurants. So there's this idea, at least in part in the government, that this new administration is concerned about the well-being of more rank and file soldiers. So interesting. I don't think the government has yet touched, as Dr. Tickner mentioned, really contentious issues. So police reform is still an important issue. And under any administration, for that matter, it is a very difficult issue to take on, especially in Colombia. We know that it is what we have seen across the hemisphere, and especially in Latin America, is that the normal thing is to have very unsuccessful police reform. It is extremely difficult to change these patterns into a more human rights oriented type of policing. The legacies of militarization are extremely profound, and changing this is hard. And I don't think the government has yet or is starting to prepare for this, but it's going to be an incredible challenge under any circumstance. For a civilian leftist administration, much harder, because the expectation is different. And likewise with the armed forces. So one of the kind of tasks that were left pending after the peace agreement with the FARC is actually security sector reform, because the Santos administration and the negotiation made it quite clear that security sector reform was not on the table. So something that is normal in the course of any agreement was not undertaken, at least systematically, as part of the previous peace agreement. So having a profound security sector reform for a new Colombia, the role of the armed forces in a new context, that's still kind of open, and we still don't know where we're going to head with this. So again, I'm much more optimistic than I was 6 months ago, but it doesn't mean that there's not considerable obstacles ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Albarracin. So we have received a number of questions in the chat box. I wanted to remind our audience that if they would like to ask questions, they should send the questions into the chat box, and I'll work them into the conversation, which I'm going to begin doing now. I wanted to shift the focus a little bit more explicitly to rural areas. We had talked about this issue earlier somewhat when we were talking about criminal governance in rural areas, the autodefensas gaitanistas, the debate about their sometimiento, and then of course the peace negotiations with the ELN are kind of both questions that are related to rural areas. But I wanted to focus specifically on rural policy and social policy. How do you see, and I wanted to start with Dr. Albarracin with this question, how do you see social policy developing under Mr. Petro's administration? And in particular, how do you see his government's agrarian reform policies developing? And I wanted to add to this a question put to us by Maya Jaskowski, which is, what is the government's policy towards communities that have been displaced? And more specifically, how is it handling scenarios regarding large-scale extractive industries, extractive firms that have established projects in areas where communities have previously resided?
Yeah, so this is a huge topic. I mean, you can imagine that addressing socioeconomic issues for a leftist administration is a core of its agenda. And there's several kind of fronts in which this is happening. One of them, rural development, the creation of the Ministry for Equality and Equity under the leadership of Vice President Marquez. And you can even think of tax reform, and the tax reform is a part of this kind of broader social policy issue. But when we focus about rural development, and I'm using rural development instead of land reform, because I think rural development encompasses kind of a broader set. Any policies regarding land, they're much more, we're talking about a lot of policies that include land redistribution, but include also aspects that were mentioned in the question, like reparations. And giving back land that was taken away, expropriated as part of the armed conflict, but it also includes other issues regarding ethnic communities, for that matter, and other forms of rural development. So the rural development agenda is clearly at the center in these first 100 days, and the government has had some early victories, so to speak. So controversial, but you can call it a victory, the agreement that the Ministry of Agriculture and the presidency had with the livestock sector, the ganaderos, who are probably the sector that's most going to oppose any attempt at redistribution, rural development, or changing patterns of land tenure in Colombia. So the fact that the Ministry of Agriculture managed to have an agreement in which the government is going to buy land from the ganaderos, from the livestock producers, and redistribute to other people, it's an interesting political move, because it's kind of it's bringing in a sector that's considerably intransigent with this issue and bringing them to the table and kind of making this. There has been a kind of an attempt, or at least you see more policy initiative and more implementation initiative in parts of land reform and land redistribution that were there in the past. So a lot of what the government is doing is essentially implementing aspects of the peace agreement that were left dormant by the previous Duque administration. So there's a lot of this that was in the previous peace agreement, and by all of these agencies that are monitoring the implementation of the peace agreement, including the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame, you see that the land sector part of the agreement was the one that had the least implementation. And I mean, so you're seeing an acceleration of initiatives in this kind of space. But these are policies that already existed and were the result of the previous agreement. So there, you see that happening. The government, in my first comment, I mean, the government was really, the Petro administration was smart in bringing in people who are very experienced to manage some of the ministries. And this is the case of the Ministry of Agriculture. We have Minister Cecilia Lopez, who has long experience in previous governments and connected to the more called progressive side of the Liberal Party, who's part of this broader coalition. So she comes with a lot of experience in this, but in the implementation and then kind of the starting of getting an idea of what the rural development policy of the government is going to be, you start seeing some internal tensions within the broader coalition, because of course there's parts of the government coalition, particularly close to Parque Histórico and to rural movements, more grassroots movements, who have a more, let's call it an agenda that is more strongly redistributive, and is looking at the government to really implement a more redistributive agenda and less about agenda about reparations and distribution of land. And you see kind of the ministry and its leadership less towards this pole. So you have tensions, and you've seen comments by the minister that are indicating that there's some tension between these different actors within the government coalition, because in and of itself, within the government, this is a contentious issue. How you implement some of these aspects, what you're going to implement, how far you're going to go into the redistributive end of this. There's no answer from within. These are issues that are in dispute, and will probably be in dispute throughout the period. So you see more activity, you see more implementation of things that already existed, and I think you're trying to define new ways in which the Petro administration will have new policy initiatives regarding this issue. So I think, if anything, what you see is like this became central to the agenda in a way that it hasn't been in decades, for the matter. I mean, you mentioned La Revolución en Marcha. I mean, this issue has been so front and center for a presidential administration.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Albarracin. Dr. Tickner, I wanted to ask you how you see rural policy, rural development policy, land reform, and dealing with displaced persons and communities under the Petro administration.
I don't have much to add. I think without a doubt, the whole question of land is at the center of armed conflict and violence in Colombia. Colombia has one of the highest levels of inequality in terms of land ownership. And so addressing this issue has always been at the center of any attempt to build peace and combat violence. And yet, as Juan has pointed out, even though I wouldn't call it agrarian reform because elites have been allergic to using that term. The whole question of land distribution was actually at the center of the peace accords with FARC, and yet the government of Duque was reluctant to implement that portion. So I think he is absolutely correct in stating that much of what the Petro government is doing until now is simply to implement in a robust fashion those agreements struck up with FARC, which obviously were viewed as key to building peace in Colombia. I have very mixed feelings about the agreement negotiated with the ganaderos, which they have been responsible to a large degree for both unequal land ownership and for the support in many cases of paramilitary groups in the country. So I think that has and they stand to win in this negotiation because their lands, which are not productive, are going to be bought off at commercial rates, and so you could see this as a win-win, which I think we should. But at the same time, it seems like a very generous prize to be granted to this sector in particular that has been a key player, I would say, in a negative sense in the armed conflict in the country. One last point, just kind of as a note on how the government's inauguration has been viewed by different sectors of rural areas in Colombia. The whole question of land occupations has been an issue since the government took over. And I think Juan mentioned at the beginning the growing pains that the left governing now is undergoing. But we're talking in many cases of a government that still sees itself as civil society, and that speaks of the state as if it were something that doesn't have anything to do with them. And so in rural areas, some have viewed Petro's rise to power as an invitation to occupy lands, and this has been a point of contention that the government has had to deal with. And so it's been interesting to observe how, in particular, the Ministry of Agriculture has tried to step forward and say, the whole question of rural reform, which we're now talking about in those terms, agrarian reform, is not an invitation to occupy lands, but the population is quite impatient, I would say, in many vulnerable areas of the country. And I think this is going to continue to be a source of tension between certain very vulnerable sectors of Colombian society and the government. In terms of displacement, I see this as being center to the government's whole vision of total peace. I don't see any distinct concrete policies on paper yet in terms of specific measures to be taken to return people to their initial areas of life, and yet this is also a very key part of the peace agreements with FARC, and so it's an ongoing process, I would say, and again, the commitment of this government is to implement what has already been agreed upon in a more robust fashion. So I think what we're going to see, is a more aggressive attempt to provide both conditions of land as well as social conditions and state presence needed for those displaced communities to be able to actually return to their parts of the country.
Thank you, Dr. Tigner. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and ask about what you see, Dr. Tigner, as some of the more important foreign policy initiatives being undertaken by the Petro administration. And how have or will Colombia's relations with Venezuela and the United States change in the coming years?
This is also a policy that's still in the process of being developed, but there are several cues as to what the government's foreign policy is starting to look like. I'm just going to pick, I read some of the questions in the chat as well. Jonathan asks about U.S. military bases in Colombia. I just want to make clear that there are no U.S. military bases in Colombia, but I do want to point out that obviously one potential source of tension with the United States is going to be the extremely deep levels of cooperation in the realm of security that the two countries have maintained over the course of years, both in Colombia and in third countries. I'll start with the United States then. It's been interesting to observe the degree to which Washington has gone out of its way to court, and I don't know of a better word to describe what's going on. It's a courtship going on in order to maintain a semblance of closeness with a country that has been historically, I would say, the United States' strongest ally. And so over the course of decades, the two countries have struck up a very close strategic relationship, built on trust and kind of affinity of worldviews. And the U.S. sees this obviously with concern as all potentially falling apart in a government of the left. And so there's been a number of different encounters promoted largely by the United States to make clear that Washington's willing, I would say, to bend over almost backwards to be able to accommodate, the new priorities of the Petro government. And so there's several aspects on which there's agreement that cooperation can take place. Everything related to the environment and the transition to clean energies is something that is at the top of the two governments' agendas, and that opens up space for bilateral relations viewed in a different way. Even in terms of drug policy, the Biden administration has obviously, transited towards a more integral, less punitive policy. And so this too opens up space for cooperation. I just want to address another question that was posed by John about what the end of the drug war means, given that this has been a key part of bilateral relations between Colombia and the United States. When I talk about the end of the drug war, I'm not saying that Colombia is now going to freely export cocaine, which is what he suggests in the question. The war on drugs has essentially been a lens through which the U.S. has constructed its counter-narcotics policy and imposed it upon many parts of the world. And we're talking about a policy that deems illicit drugs as a threat to security, which then leads to militarized, punitive prohibitionist policies, which have proven to be completely counterproductive in addressing both production and consumption. So that's what I mean by the end of the drug war. And so both countries have transited towards different types of drug strategies. In the United States, as many of you know, cannabis is now legal, or recreationally speaking, or for medical purposes in pretty much all of the United States, even though at the federal level it continues to be deemed illegal. And so on cannabis, there's tremendous space for cooperation. The Colombian government has suggested not legalizing cocaine, but certainly separating coca leaf from cocaine, and trying to move away from the more repressionist policies towards coca leaf, which is produced by, poor farmers who really have no other alternative. So I think even on drug policy, the two governments have found areas of cooperation. On migration too, and this will let me mention Venezuela, there's also tremendous space for cooperation. The U.S. is quite content, obviously, for the 2 million plus Venezuelans who live now in Colombia, not to move north towards U.S. borders. And so I think that this will continue to be used strategically by the Petro government with an eye to securing U.S. assistance to attend to the Venezuelan population here. And just on migration, given that there was another question, the view of migration that the Petro government has kind of put forward is a less securitizing view and a more protectionist view, if you wish. And so in regards to these tremendously disconcerting migration flows through the Darien region, what the government is proposing is a policy through which it does not pretend to stop migration flows from traversing the country, but yet to provide protection and secure conditions of passage to those groups who use Colombia as a migration transit point. In terms of Venezuela, and I'll stop here, there's as I mentioned at the beginning, almost on day one, Petro announced, the normalization of relations with Venezuela. We now have ambassadors in each country. The border has been opened. Petro just met with Maduro in Caracas. Flights have been resumed to connect the two countries. And yet there's still obviously much to be done in terms of normalizing. We're talking about a border that was closed for 7 years. And so we have illegal passages through the two countries that, are occupied by violent non-state actors. None of this is going to go away, but, in a few days. So there remains a lot of work to be done in terms of the different steps that need to be taken in order to create full normalization in these relations. Something that I think worries the United States, and I will stop here, has to do with Petro's position towards the lack of democracy in Venezuela. Petro is insisting that Venezuela rejoin the inter-American system, with an eye to reinserting it into the inter-American fold. But he is, careful in speaking out against human rights violations and the lack of democracy in Venezuela. And I think this is something that, the United States and Europe are very much hoping that he will do.
Thank you, Dr. Tickner. So, Dr. Albarracin, on the foreign policy side, I wanted to follow up with you and ask you explicitly about how you see the recent election of Luis Inácio Lula da Silva as president of Brazil this last weekend, how that could play out in terms of Colombian foreign policy and what the implications of that election, right, and bringing another government on the left to power in Latin America, what implications that could have for the Petro administration.
Yeah, that's certainly, and I see the election of Lula da Silva in Brazil. If you think about it in a broader context of where Colombian foreign policy can place itself right now, it's probably the more the international context, or at least the regional context, that offers the greatest opportunities for an administration by Petro. If you think about it, had we had Petro, say, elected in 2018, the options would have been much more limited. If you have had a Trump administration in the United States and a Bolsonaro administration in Brazil, clearly very different environment for the Petro administration. And in that sense, the election of Lula and his the start of his administration in January often opens a lot of opportunities for the Petro administration in particular, and its kind of orientation of its foreign policy towards a greater engagement with Latin America. And there are a host of issues in which there is a need for cooperation between Brazil and Colombia. You think about deforestation of the Amazon. That is a clear issue where both governments have to cooperate, and it would have been almost really impossible to cooperate with the Bolsonaro administration has presided over basically the increase of deforestation in the Amazon. But there's also a host of security issues in the borders where you need stronger cooperation with Brazil, and having a more friendly government, a considerably more friendly government in Brazil certainly helps the situation. There's some issues in which you might see, I wouldn't say tension, but there's differences in opinion. These are somewhat different lefts that you're seeing here with Lula and Petro, at least in their coalitions, regarding extractivism and mining and kind of energy change, while the Lula administration is not averse to policies of energy transformation and change in energy policy. Oil and mining still remain a very central part of kind of the development agenda in Brazil, and the PT government is going to keep strengthening Petrobras and kind of this other mining sector. And that's something where at least part of the Petro administration has been quite reticent and very anxious to change the agenda there. So not to say that there's going to be conflict, but there's differences there. There's other points where, again, Amazon security, where you might see greater kind of engagement. But again, for the Petro administration, the context right now in the region is incredibly favorable to advance its agenda. And just as my last point, the intersection of its foreign policy with its national agenda is quite clear. So rethinking the relationships with and restarting the relationships with Venezuela, for that matter, are crucial for aspects that Professor Tickner mentioned. Not only migration, but the negotiations with the ELN, other broader border issues regarding organized criminality, but also aspects of the trade agenda. They are key issues for the Petro administration, domestically speaking. Relationships with Brazil regarding the environment, those are key issues in the domestic agenda of Colombia. So in many ways, foreign policy also reflects a lot of what you're seeing as part of the domestic agenda of this administration.
Thank you, Dr. Albarracin. Dr. Tickner, I just wanted to follow up with you to see if you had anything to say about the changing dimensions of the relationship with Colombia. And also, since we were talking a little bit about the question of migration in response to Christina Francois' question, ask you about how you see relations with Panama evolving.
So you're asking about Panama, but I didn't quite get the first part.
Well, relations with Panama evolving in the context
right.
of the Darien Gap. So,
but the first part was the first part directed towards any other country in particular?
Oh, I just asked, since Brazil's such a big country.
Okay, yeah, I do have something to say. I was
yeah.
trying to leave some topics for Juan instead of not.
I know.
I do want to make one note about Latin America. Latin America is key to the Petro government's foreign policy. I think it's an overstatement to say that we're observing a second pink tide. The conditions in Latin America are so dramatically different and unfavorable in terms of in terms of the prospects for both collective action and even integration, that I am a little bit less optimistic. The differences between governments are much more pronounced than in the early 2000s. And now we have, a tremendous fracture between more democratically inclined governments of the left, or that self-define as the left, because not all of them are of the left on many issues, and those that are non-democratic. So where I do see an interesting area of kind of more focused cooperation is between Colombia, Brazil, and Chile, for instance, where we have three like-minded, democratically elected, and committed governments to democracy and human rights, both committed to the environment and committed to issues of social inclusion, both gender rights as well as LGBTQ community, racial issues. I see interesting areas of both regional cooperation there and also of global projection. And here, the issue of the environment, unless the countries of the region act together, it's going to be very hard to elicit, I would say, international cooperation. And so this I see with a little less skepticism as I do kind of the whole notion of a new progressive tide in the region. In terms of Panama, I don't really have much information as to advances in the relation. There have been conversations, obviously, taking place between the two governments from Duque on. I think, given the size of the migration wave that is arriving at the Darien Gap from Colombia, and the humanitarian crisis that this is creating, both amongst those people migrating, as well as in that area of Colombia where they are concentrating, is forcing the Petro government to speak more robustly with Panama, with an eye to striking up some type of an agreement. But here is one area where there's important discrepancies between different governments in Latin America, how we treat migration. And so whereas in the chat, someone was mentioning, Panama's more securitized policy, how do we keep these people out? Which is very much the policy of Mexico as well in its agreements with the United States. The Petro government's policy is going to be completely different. Petro is opposed to securitizing migration and to creating, walls and whatnot in order to stop migration. And he's opposed to expelling migrants as well. And so it's, it remains to be seen to what degree his decision to provide security and protection for those migrants going through the Darien Gap is going to be well received or not by the Panamanian government.
Thank you, Dr. Tickner. Dr. Albarracin, I wanted to make sure I got back to you on the question of drug policy and drug reform. Both Ken Frankel and John Epen asked questions about drug policy reform, and I just wanted you to reflect a little bit on how you see the evolution of drug policy reform under Mr. Petro's government.
Yeah, I think Professor Tickner already alluded to this in several of her interventions, but I think this landmark speech that President Petro gave at the United Nations a couple of weeks ago, it became kind of this moment where a lot of what the views on drug war became really verbalized, so to speak. And it's an interesting speech, but I also think it's interesting to see that this wider context in which is the new thinking of drug policy is happening. So you have, as Professor Tickner mentioned, you have an international context which is more favorable to at least tolerating or accepting certain changes in drug policies and kind of broader war on drugs policies, at least at the margins, or at least at a domestic level. So you're not going to see a great change, at least not. I mean, maybe Professor Tickner, you might this might be interesting to hear what you think, but I don't think you're going to see a change in the global prohibitionist regime, at least formally speaking. That this is a very hard regime to change internationally. But you do see governments trying to engage or bend over backwards, as Professor Tickner mentioned, to accommodate certain changes that are happening both domestically, but also abroad in the case of the United States. So you see a Petro administration that is trying to emphasize or at least change the way it's approaching the war on drugs policies and trying to go away from those more punitivist and kind of militaristic approaches to drug trafficking, and in particular, the strategy was basically affecting over proportionally kind of the weakest part of the chain, coca-growing peasants in Colombia, and trying to re-emphasize and reorienting these policies to attack other parts of the chain. It's not that other parts of the chain were never a subject of policy, but really think the way this happens. And I think when you think about drug policy, it has important intersections with the rural development agenda, but also with the implementation of part of the peace agreement that's completely obliterated by the Duque administration, which was the PNI. So this national plan for illicit crop substitution. So you see at the local, the national level kind of efforts to rethink the drug policy in kind of concrete policy ways. And you see at the kind of international, kind of the more ideas level, a president who's more active in trying to say this has been a failure. He's not the first person to say it's a failure. Other important political figures have it, but I think it is incredibly, at least symbolically important, that a acting Colombian president is kind of making this claim and saying this is really not what we should be doing. Not that this is going to change dramatically how the regime is constituted at the international level, but at least it's sending an important signal. It is important that Colombia is sending that signal. And at the same time, finding ways in which to cooperate with the United States. So for example, questions that are quite sensitive within the relationship with the United States and that are related to drug policy, which is extradition, for example. That is a very sensitive issue. And that is an issue that in which this relationship has to evolve. And so I see that kind of this interesting game in which we might not see broader changes in the international level, but at least some level of tolerance to other approaches to drug policy in Colombia. Again, away from this extremely repressive policy against peasants, allowing more of a kind of a human development type of approach to the control of coca cultivation, opening up spaces for some forms of legal consumption and legalization of some sort. So that's where I see it. And also quite clearly this kind of symbolic change, which shouldn't be underestimated.
Thank you, Dr. Albarracin. We have a couple questions here that are related to foreign policy that I will put initially to Dr. Tickner. Luis Castro asks about Petro's proposal to the US to remove visa requirements for Colombians, and Juan Corredor asks about the militarization of the Amazon.
I don't think that we are going to see a militarization of the Amazon. Petro's discourse on the Amazon has been quite the contrary. And I think that the government, given the lack of expertise on security and defense policy, is still kind of grappling with the experiment of Artemisa that's mentioned in the question. But I don't see this. I don't see this happening. What the government is proposing, obviously, is not only strategies to protect the Amazon and to combat deforestation, but is also looking into schemes by which debt relief might be provided internationally in exchange for commitments to deforestation, to combating deforestation or to reforesting. So I think the policy of the government is moving in a completely opposite direction. In terms of the debate about visas for Colombian citizens, this is something that many countries that have a strategic partnership with the United States request. Great Britain has just removed the visa requirement for Colombian nationals. And yet I don't see it going very far within the current context of the United States. And this has essentially been the message of the US government, which has been very, very diplomatic in recognizing the legitimacy of this request, but also I think trying to lower expectations in terms of the timing that this will require, and also in private the potential change in the political climate in the United States after the midterm elections on Tuesday. So essentially the message is, the US government is open to this, but yet we don't, it could happen, but it may take some time.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Tickner. Well, our time is up. Thank you so much to Dr. Tickner and Dr. Albarracin for their thoughtful contributions to our conversation today. And thank you to everybody for attending our event. Have a good afternoon.